This is BBC World News. I'm James Reynolds. Our top stories. The veteran American civil rights leader and long-serving Congressman John Lewis has died at the age of 80. EU leaders struggle to reach an agreement on a €750 billion economic recovery package to repair the damage done by the coronavirus pandemic. Thousands of protesters join a march in Russia's Far East, supporting an arrested governor seen as a threat to Vladimir Putin. Plus, the Irish dancer from Virginia, who's taking the internet by storm. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. One of the last surviving leaders of the civil rights movement of 1960s America, John Lewis, has died following a battle with pancreatic cancer. He was 80 years old and he'd been a congressman for more than 30 years. Rajini Vajanathan has been looking back at John Lewis's extraordinary life.
John Lewis was one of the most enduring figures in the civil rights movement. Dedicating his life to fighting racism, he marched alongside Martin Luther King and lived to see a black president. Born in Alabama in 1940, John Lewis grew up in an America that was deeply segregated.
I would come home and ask my mother, ask my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why segregation, why racial discrimination? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But Dr. King inspired me to get in the way, to get in trouble.
The two men met when John Lewis was just a teenager.
I wanted to go and attend Troy State College. It was a school that had never admitted black students. So I wrote a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. and told him I needed his help. He wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. So in March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, and I saw Martin Luther King Jr. standing behind a desk. I was so scared. And Dr. King spoke up and said, "Are you John Lewis? Are you the boy from Troy?"
And so the boy from Troy became a civil rights leader himself. As a student, he took part in sit-ins to protest against white-only lunch counters.
I was beaten, arrested, and taken to jail. But when I was arrested, I felt so free. I felt so liberated. You arrest me, you beat me, you throw me in jail. Well, what else can you do to me? You kill me. But Dr. King said, it is better to die a physical death than to die a spiritual or psychological death.
And the Reverend Martin Luther King head the march.
In August 1963, John Lewis was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, where Dr. King delivered his famous I Have a Dream address.
When the march was all over, when Dr. King had finished speaking, we all were invited to come down to the White House and to meet with President Kennedy. We were ready. We were prepared.
And so they marched again for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. But their message of non-violence ended brutally as they were attacked by the police. By the 50th anniversary of that iconic march, John Lewis had become a politician and was known as the conscience of the US Congress.
Pursuit of equality and justice for all.
At the age of 70, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor.
We cannot give up now. We cannot give in. We must keep the faith, keep our eyes on the prize. We must go out and vote like we never, ever voted before. Yeah!
In recent months, he was seen at marches after the killing of George Floyd. For a man who lived through so many chapters of the civil rights movement, the pain of racial injustice in America never went away, nor did the fight against it. For John Lewis, the mantra was simple: never give up, never give in.
For more on John Lewis's legacy, I've been speaking to the son of Martin Luther King Jr., the human rights activist Martin Luther King III.
You know, I remember John Lewis as a compassionate, a forthright, um, and really human rights activist who focused a lot on ensuring the right to vote would be available for all people. Whether he was in Congress, whether he was on the City Council of Atlanta, where he started his political career, or whether he was in India. We had an opportunity to travel to India in 2009, and my wife and I led a delegation of observing the 50th anniversary that mother and father had come to that country. And so John Lewis was beyond a giant in terms of what he personified, bringing the best out of everyone. And he really showed us how to do that by saying, you know, I am committed to bringing about justice. And he always encouraged young people to be engaged in the fight for justice and the fight to vote and the fight to end things that were wrong in our society.
Your father bought John Lewis a bus ticket when John Lewis was 18. They got to know each other. Tell us about the relationship between the two men.
So over a period of time, of course, John Lewis, number one, was inspired by hearing Dad's messages on the radio as a young man, a young boy, actually. And that inspiration caused him later on to write a letter to Dad, and Dad, as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 and beyond, later on becoming the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, John Lewis joined Dad in Montgomery and was asking for help and assistance. And then, of course, because he was inspired, John Lewis was involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as one of its leaders. In fact, in 1965, as one of the leaders of SNCC, he and Hosea Williams, who was with SCLC, worked with my father directly, marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And of course, he was tragically beaten, but he never stopped. This is very interesting. He could have stopped then and said, you know, I didn't plan to do all of this. But he continued on that quest to set an example for all of us so that we could become a more and better and perfect union, which we certainly are not yet, but we're still working on it. That's who John Lewis is, though, a person who was dependable, a person who was well respected, a person who tried to work with people regardless of their views. He brought people together. He was a convener.
I'm joined now by Dr. Clarence B. Jones, Director of the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. Dr. Jones was a personal counsel, advisor and draft speechwriter of Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. Jones, how will you remember Congressman Lewis?
I remember him as a young man and then as an older man in his years in Congress, but as a young man who was fearless. Devoted to eliminating racial segregation, applied his own personal experiences in growing up in a sharecropper family and experiencing the firsthand toe and heel of racism. And of course, he was influenced very much by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and by another great civil rights personality, Reverend James Lawson. So I remember him as a field soldier, as someone from the very time he got involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of which at one point he was chairman. He worked 24/7, as they say, to eliminate racial segregation, and was particularly focused on the right to vote, of protecting the right to vote, and then after securing the right to vote, of encouraging people some of whom may not have ever voted before, to vote. He was fearless, he was tireless, and he was it was a person for all seasons. And it's ironic that during this same period of time is that I knew John well, not as well as others, because I was not his contemporary. But during 24 hours before John's announced death, a colleague whom I worked very, very closely with, the Reverend C.T. Vivian, died at the age of 95. And so you're beginning to see some great civil rights trees fall in the forest.
Doctor?
Regrettably or not regrettably, it's just in the nature of things that there will be others who fall by nature of their longevity.
That generation of the 1960s, of which you are now a part, is following John Lewis's death down to its last survivors. Are you able to sum up the place of that generation in American history?
Yes. That generation was, I guess, sometimes in a presidential speech, Obama made reference to it. He referred to it as the Moses generation, a generation that sought to lead our country to the promised land, out of the wilderness of segregation, into what was going to be a later generation of Obama. He and Dr. King and C.D. Vivian, Diane Nash, who's still living, and others. And every time I see photos of people that many of you don't know, but I see Jose Williams, and I see photos of Zerona Clayton, who is still with us, and of course Andy Young, who is still with us. But all of us are getting older. I'm going to be 90 years old, God willing, in less than 6 months. And so what we did under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., with such outstanding, what I call lieutenant generals, such as John Lewis and the Reverend C.T. Vivian, we transformed America because we appealed to the soul of America, asking it the question, we can do better than this. We are better than a nation that has high-pressure fire hoses and police dogs and bully clubs and young boys and girls seeking to end segregation. We can do better than this, than people who were being run over by horseback on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So his and C.T. Vivian's legacy and others will be enduring. It's enduring because it's written in the streets of our country and in the souls of our people. And as such, they have carved a place in eternity.
Dr. Clarence B. Jones, thank you so much. Moving on to other news now. European Union leaders in Brussels are struggling to reach agreement on an economic recovery package worth €750 billion to repair the damage done by the coronavirus. A revised plan has been put forward on the second day of the summit. It's being discussed now. The BBC's Europe correspondent Gavin Lee explains the sticking points.
The main element is that €500 billion is to be given out as grants to countries worst hit by COVID-19, so Italy and Spain. But the Dutch are saying, no, there have to be strict conditions. We have to sign off on it, effectively give a veto to every country who say, what are the reasons? OK, we sign off for this tranche of cash. Now, Bojo Borisov, who's the Bulgarian Prime Minister, he reportedly said that Mark Rutte was acting as the policeman of Europe. So tensions last night. There's a new proposal on the table today in which the EU Council are saying slash 50 billion off this grant fund. So let's say it's 450 billion in grants, the rest in loans to make up, as you say, 750 billion. And if you've got a problem with, say, Italy or Spain or who else asking for this cash and wanting reasons, raise it with the European Commission. It's not a veto, but it helps. Now, the Dutch have said that is a significant step forward. My only take on this, I've just had a message from one senior EU council official, and she has said they're going to go through plenty of face masks and hand gel if there's going to be any white smoke here.
That was Gavin Lee. Tom Nuttall is the Berlin bureau chief for The Economist. I asked him whether or not the coronavirus pandemic has shown any new cracks in the EU.
The big dynamic that has shifted the politics of this discussion is that 2 months ago, France and Germany agreed that the EU should issue common debt at large scale for the first time in its history to fund a plan to help the countries hardest hit by COVID-19, notably Italy and Spain in southern Europe. Now, what they're up against is a grouping of countries, the self-styled Frugal Four, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark and Sweden, who are resisting a plan of that magnitude. And that's where the fault line inside the EU lies now. But it is very much big countries against small ones.
What are we learning about the negotiating skills of the new EU leaders, Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen?
It's a huge test for them. Neither of them have been in office for very long. And what's happened with this discussion is that it's become folded into something that was already there, which was negotiations among the EU leaders about their regular 7-year budget, which is due to start in 2021. At the start of the year, that was being negotiated. It was extremely difficult. It always is. Then along came COVID. Then along came this very ambitious plan to channel funds to those hardest hit countries. That negotiation is now grouping all of these discussions together, and that's a huge test for Charles Michel, who is chairing this discussion today. If he can pull it off, it'll be a big feather in his cap.
Tom Nuttall there. The president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, has said that 25 million Iranians have now been infected with coronavirus. That figure is nearly 100 times the official number. In a televised speech, Mr. Rouhani did not explain the discrepancy, but he said the figures were based on a new Ministry of Health report. 14,000 Iranians have lost their lives to COVID-19, according to official figures. Iran has been the country worst hit by the coronavirus in the Middle East. Kasra Naji from BBC Persian has more details.
What he's talking about is herd immunity, and he's basically arguing that we have had so many people contracting it, 25 million, according to a estimate by the health ministry, according to a scenario. What they have, on the basis of what information they have, they come up with a figure that we already have had 25 million people contracting, and we're going to get 30 to 35 million more contracting in the next months, up to another 8 or 9 months probably. So that's what and he also says that according to our figures, out of every 1,000 people contracted, 500 show no signs of it. So he's basically saying that the rest of the country are going to get it, but don't necessarily going to show signs of it. But the warning is about hospitalization. He says we've had 200,000 people hospitalized in the last 6 months, and we're going to have double that already in the BBC Persian. We're getting a lot of messages from Iran that hospitals are inundated.
I know it's obviously difficult sometimes to get information from Iran, but from what you can tell, are people believing the figures given by the president?
There's still quite a bit of skepticism, and these figures are indications, if you like. We never know what the actual figures may be. They haven't given it. We're not unlikely to get it soon. But it shows that we are in the middle of a second wave of this outbreak, and the second wave seems to be more serious than the first peak in April. It came down in May, and it's gone up again. The daily deaths are more than what they were at the peak of a month ago, 2 months ago.
Kasra Naji there. Tens of thousands of Russians have taken to the streets in the far eastern city of Khabarovsk to demand the release of the local governor. Sergei Furgal was arrested on murder charges and flown to Moscow last week. Protesters claim that his arrest was politically motivated. From Khabarovsk, our correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports.
They poured in from across the region. Freedom, they chanted. And send him home. It was one of the largest protests Khabarovsk has ever seen. 7 time zones east of Moscow. They've been taking to the streets for a week now. And he is the reason why. Sergei Furgal is the local governor. We're all Furgal, he says. He's popular here, more popular, they say, than President Putin. But last week, he was arrested. Officers flew in from Moscow, bundled him into a car, and flew him back to the capital. He's been charged with involvement in murders dating back 15 years. And that sparked anger in Khabarovsk.
Everybody understands that it's a political case. They have stolen him, our governor, from us. So they just took him, and everybody feels like we elected him. It was our choice, and Moscow took him.
What is remarkable about these scenes is that in Russia, unauthorized protests like this are normally broken up. But the police just stood and watched. The Russian authorities clearly trying to avoid creating even more anger on the streets and more resentment of Moscow.
Such a public display of dissent is embarrassing for the Kremlin. President Putin likes to portray himself as the man who has given Russia stability, but this protest is undermining that image.
We did find one man in Khabarovsk who's against the protests. The city's mayor. He's from the Kremlin's party.
We have seen certain people going to the protests, shouting the same slogans and acting inappropriately, and they're being paid to do this.
There's no evidence of that. All they want is for their governor to be given a fair trial in Khabarovsk. But the danger for the Kremlin is that if this continues, a local hero could become a national star. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Khabarovsk.
Morgan Bullock is an African-American Irish dancer from Richmond, Virginia. After a video of her fancy footwork went viral, she was flooded with messages of praise from all around the world, including this one from then Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar. He invited her to dance in Ireland for St Patrick's Day 2021. Some have accused her, though, of cultural appropriation. She's been speaking to our reporter Colin Flynn.
When you think of Irish dancing, this probably isn't what comes to mind. This is 21-year-old Morgan Bullock, an Irish dancer from Richmond, Virginia, who recently went viral for her dancing on TikTok. Morgan was just a little girl when she saw Irish dancing for the very first time.
I remember how energetic it was and the bright dress, and it just was something like I had never seen before. It became a huge part of my life.
She started going to classes a few times a week and attended dance competitions. And Morgan, when you went into those Irish dancing classes, were you the only African-American girl in the class?
Yeah, I was always the only one in my class.
Did that ever have any effect on you, or how did that make you feel?
I don't think I ever considered it an issue. It was definitely something that I took note of, but I had grown up in a predominantly white area, so it wasn't something that I was uncomfortable about.
After going viral with her Irish dancing, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive, but there were a few who thought that what she was doing was inappropriate. The negative comments that people were leaving under the video, what were people saying?
Just early on, like shortly after posting it, some people were saying that what I was doing was cultural appropriation just because I don't look like what you would typically picture an Irish dancer to look like. But I mean,
So were they saying because you weren't Irish and because you were not white that you shouldn't be performing Irish dancing?
Yeah, basically that's what they were saying.
After the video went viral, Morgan was invited onto a very popular Irish radio show where she was surprised by Padraig Moyles, the lead dancer of Riverdance.
If you're up for it, we'd love you to join us in Vienna, Virginia to perform in Riverdance.
Oh my God. Oh, I would love to do that. My heart just dropped.
I think you're going to do an amazing job. I know that.
It was unreal. Riverdance is like the end goal for me with dancing. So the opportunity to perform with Riverdance is amazing. It's been postponed, so I'm not sure about the dates for the US tour, but I mean, I'll be there whenever it is.
The dancer Morgan Bullock. A reminder of our main news. Tributes have been paid to the congressman and civil rights activist John Lewis, who has died at the age of 80. One activist has written, an elder, now an ancestor. Please do stay with BBC World News.